Hello, my name is Jason Miller. I'm representing the ECHO team consisting of myself, Dexter Van, and Nicholas Chamberlain. We're here to discuss the Target data breach from 2013. In this presentation, we're going to talk about some general information about the Target breach, some potential opportunities where Target could have stopped or reduced the effects of that breach, the opportunities that Target had with their public response, and also some recommendations for policy change for this company. Looking at the breach as a whole, we're looking at the root causes, some details and scope of the breach there, and also, again, their response and mitigation efforts that they took and some preventative actions they could have taken to fix that before they got to that point. So looking at the scope of the data breach, about 40 million pieces of payment information were stolen. In addition to that 40 million pieces, there was also another 70 million pieces of personal information on their customers that was also taken at the same time. As of 2015, Target had reported direct costs of the breach at 248 million. Now, that's most likely not their whole number. The Congressional Research Service reported on it and showed that likely that cost does not take into account any lack of consumer confidence, any fines or penalties that may or may not have been assessed at that point, and also any other threats to their customer base that came out of that that were not a direct cost to Target themselves. When looking at the data breach, the bigger issue was Target wasn't the initial target. Their initial breach happened through a vendor that was not directly connected to them, not directly connected to their POS systems. It was a vendor that handled their HVAC and refrigeration maintenance, Phasea Mechanical. Unfortunately, that vendor was not running any malware detection software that offered any real-time scanning. Their staff wasn't properly trained to where they would be able to report and identify potential phishing activity, and because of that, they were the victim of a phishing attack, and the credentials that they used to access Target's network were stolen at that point. That initial breach happened in September of 2013, which was a little over 2 months before the initial breach into the Target network. During the course of the build-up to the breach, Target was warned multiple times by their security providers that there was some activity that was maybe not necessarily legitimate on their network. And unfortunately, that was something that they didn't review and didn't react to in a timely manner. And most likely that attributed to a lot of the scope of this breach. Target generally did not employ this very significant security measures within their network. Their ineffective protections allowed for very deep access into their network, getting from somewhere that was largely a perimeter area of their network into their very deeply secured POS systems should not have been as easy or even as possible as it was. The lack of monitoring that they did just hindered their ability to detect this breach. And their POS systems, in addition to that, weren't secured to prevent the installation of any outside software. They were not hardened to only run their authorized software, so it allowed the attacker to install a custom piece of software on there to steal the credit card information while it was in an unencrypted state. Now, Target had several systems in place to secure their network. However, those systems were woefully inefficient due to the fact that their culture did not promote that secure environment. They weren't in a position where they were actively monitoring the systems to make sure that they were getting to the bottom of why they were seeing these security alerts coming through. And unfortunately, that allowed their attackers to get a very deep foothold into their network. So basically, the way the attack went, the attacker back in September sent a phishing attack through via email to Phasea Mechanical, was able to acquire a credential to get into to log into Target's network. Once they were able to get into there, they got in and were able to gain access to some vulnerable machines on the network, which when they did that, they were able to install some additional software to help maintain their foothold and also to continue to allow them to access deeper areas of the network. As they did that, they also were able to then access the POS system and began installing malware onto the POS terminals themselves. So basically what ended up happening was the data was being sent from those POS terminals back to the compromised hosts that they had ended up installing their exfiltration software on the network. And then afterwards it was encrypted and sent off the network to their drop sites around the world, where the attacker could then have access to them, which allowed them to maintain a level of privacy where they weren't necessarily being put out there as an exposed piece of information because it was encrypted and it was run from those additional terminals. In addition, because of the length of time that it took for Target to detect the breach, the attackers were able to not only map out traffic on the network to identify when the busiest periods were, which allowed them to more intelligently send that data off the network where it may not have been noticed. Looking at their containment of the breach, ultimately the breach was not really contained by Target until after outside contact had been received by them from the Department of Justice. Target was warned by their security providers prior to the breach beginning and prior to data exfiltration beginning on November 30th and again on December 2nd that the software detected a malware application on their network. They looked at it, reviewed it, and unfortunately decided that it wasn't something that they needed to look further into. At that point, the attackers were free to begin collecting, harvesting, and exfiltrating data off their network. And it wasn't until December 12th that the Department of Justice finally notified them that they had that there was evidence that there was a breach on their network. And it wasn't until the 15th that they had reported that they had the breach contained. So it took an additional 3 days from the time that the Department of Justice had gotten a hold of them. Now, looking at the damage to what was actually out there, personally identifiable information was out on the web at that point, in addition to the credit card details and banking information for the individuals whose information was taken. Also, username and password information was stolen at the same time. Now, the notification, in the case of notification, normally you would want accurate, prompt communication. You want to get the facts out there to affected parties. Unfortunately, Target did not do that. The breach was announced in the press on December 18th. And only after that, the following day on December 19th, did Target make a statement announcing the data breach and announcing the details that they were willing to share at that point. Which by doing that, unfortunately, it really erodes the trust of the consumer. Now, at that point, they should have performed a security audit and updated their recovery plans accordingly after implementing security measures to ensure that the network was indeed secure and make sure that anything that's that is out of compliance currently is repaired and rectified so that it doesn't have another potential breach at that point. Looking at that, it really looks into how could Target have handled that much differently and potentially mitigated the loss, stopped the breach altogether, or at minimum, help to secure consumer confidence by getting out ahead of that story. So what we are proposing today is that we are recommending policy updates for not only the network security policies, but also the public response policies for the company. Initially, because this breach occurred at a third-party vendor outside the network, it really was something that could have been mitigated based on, let's get that vendor's information off public-facing websites. You should not be able to identify who Target's vendors are that easily from their own site. Vendor portals should require the use of a VPN and multi-factor authentication to connect. In addition, they should be monitoring their vendors to ensure that they're required to install and run a full-time background virus scanning software on all their virus and or malware scanning software on all their machines that are used to connect to their network. And really all their machines at that vendor, because if one piece of that chain gets breached, it could allow them to access that same information even if it's stored on another machine. And also any devices that are used to connect to their network should be monitored for compliance, whether that be through the use of an MDM solution such as AirWatch or another provider that would allow logging access to be made so that you can verify that they are running the appropriate materials on their systems, and just make that a contingency of them working with Target. Once you get into the network, the next step would be to secure the network itself. And part of that is making sure that the network is being analyzed for unauthorized activity and traffic that is unusual compared to its normal types. The use of a heuristic scanning IDS would be a great implementation for this, because it would allow them to identify what normal traffic looks like, and then from that point make some identification of anything that's out of the ordinary. The auditing of any creation, deletion, or modification of privileged accounts. If you're creating a domain admin account, that should be logged, and someone should be notified that that's occurring to ensure that it's supposed to happen, and also to ensure that it's a legitimate account and not a potential risk. Installing the use of honeypots, firewalls, intrusion protection systems to protect network resources. That being said, Target had those in place in some cases. Unfortunately, what they didn't have in place was the automatic response systems for the FireEye software, which could have potentially prevented this attack from occurring and reaching the scope that it did. Beyond that, you also need to harden your servers. The servers that the attackers were able to get into allowed them the ability to build up a foothold inside the network. By hardening those servers to protect against outside installations is going to go a long way to ensuring that that is protected. Monitoring systems for changes from approved configuration. Simple solution would be to install a host-based intrusion detection software that would monitor and report that information back and allow it to be logged. And ultimately require multi-factor authentication for privileged accounts to ensure that someone doesn't get in and is able to easily use a privileged account to access information. Require that secondary form of authentication through either a cell phone, email, or a Helix device that generates the random hashes. And then also they need to enact policies for consistent follow-up on reported issues. When they're seeing those issues for security issues being reported to them, they need to make sure that they're responding to those and ensuring that they are absolutely not a potential issue. Once you get down beyond that into the point-of-sale systems should consistently be up to date on all patches. Because they are a hardline piece of hardware where you have the most access to privileged information, they need to ensure that they're always on the most up-to-date thing, and any patches are installed to ensure that any vulnerabilities are patched and closed. Systems need to be configured to run using the least privilege, so they should never be using administrative accounts on any of those machines to allow them to do anything beyond what a general user would be able to do. Require any installations on their POS systems to be signed. By requiring that code to be signed by either a target key or a vendor key from a POS service provider, it would help to ensure that the software is not going to allow it to run if it's not something that's authorized to be on their system. In addition, host-level intrusion protection should be installed on all POS systems to identify and stop in its tracks any potential attacks from beginning. And then customer information should ultimately be just encrypted end-to-end and should never be left accessible in a memory in a plain text format. From a public response standpoint, this is where Target really failed the most. By allowing the news to report this out before they did, it really eroded customer confidence because it took them an additional day from the time that they were called out in the media to actually get ahead of it and get that story. Ultimately, a public response should not be a reactionary measure. It needs to be proactive. It needs to communicate the corrective actions to reassure the public that their data has been protected and that ultimately you did everything you possibly could to stop this attack and control its scope. And it also needs to be a proactive response to address those customer concerns, to ensure that the customer understands that this is not something that we expected to happen. This is something that we did work to correct and mitigate. Looking back, we talked about the Target breach. We talked about some opportunities to stop or reduce the effects of that breach, opportunities with their public response, and also their recommendations for the policy change. I thank you for your time, and I look forward to you implementing these changes.